It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome, listeners, to the Two Jacks, where we discuss all matters Australian and move around the world to discuss all matters global. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack, all the way in Hong Kong. How are you, mate?
G'day. Public holiday yesterday for May Day, of course, but, we like a public holiday here.
You do indeed. I wouldn't have thought May Day would be observed in Hong Kong, but it is. How on?
Yes, not observed as it used to be. There used to be sort of marches and things like that from the trade union groups, but they're deciding not to do it now.
So just a public holiday, just an opportunity to get on the booze on a Sunday night or a Monday. Yeah, it's on a Sunday night, so you can have a big lie-in on the Monday. Yeah,
and it's a start of what's called Golden Week in China as well. So that's when half the country has a week off. So a lot of mainland tourists here.
Which half? Which half of China's get it off?
Well, it's people in certain kinds of jobs.
Well, keep going. Professional?
Yeah, people in government employment, that sort of stuff particularly get it.
Okay.
Professional services get this one off. So.
All right. Well, a week of holidays, not for all in Hong Kong, but you'll be seeing a number of people travelling across the border onto the islands there.
Yeah, we're about halfway down from the peak to Central, and I saw a tour leader holding a stick, and I think she had about 120 people following her down our street. You can sort of meander your way through mid-levels down to Central past our place. So.
Did they stop and demand to see your presence?
No, they didn't. They just, but you can tell though. You can always just dress and all that sort of stuff. You can tell they're mainlanders.
Okay, there you go. All right, books and covers, Jack. Judging books and covers. It is just 7 more sleeps until Jim Chalmers hands down his first official budget. There've been a number of economic statements passed down since they were elected, but this is the big one, Jack. And Chalmers has sort of announced in advance that the job seeker payments solely for Australians over 55 will be increased. And of course, that's drawn a great deal of criticism for younger job seekers. We don't know how much that payment will be, how much the increase will be for the 55-plus job seekers, but it will be increased for older recipients, about 227,000 of them, Jack. What's the sense in this first?
Why are they doing it?
Yeah.
Because they can't afford to do it for everybody.
Yes, I think that's about right.
And they want to make that plain. They just can't afford to do it for everybody. And
I think Chalmers has made that argument, but the Twitter sphere is deeply unhappy, Jack, because the younger folk there on job seeker aren't going to get a brass razoo by the sounds of things.
Yeah, and I suspect that the reasoning behind it is that it's very hard for people to find a job at 55. So they're likely to become more or less permanently on job seeker, whereas the younger people, particularly in the current job market, are much more likely to be able to find work.
I tell you what bothers me about this, and it's not a question of the philosophical principles of demographics and job seeker rises. It's more this idea of drip feeding out the budget before it's actually released. I remember the 2013-14 budget handed down by Joe Hockey, in which he managed to do the near impossible, and that was offend virtually every age group, every gender group, everyone from old age pensioners to job seeker people, by releasing a bunch of information or a lot of sort of question mark stuff, much of it which didn't eventuate, But in the meantime, it set virtually everyone offside.
Yeah, I look back with pleasure on the days where the budget, the morning after the budget, the paper said beers, cigs up. These days, the papers are full of, did you win or lose? What benefits did it were for you? And that's sort of a cargo cult mentality we have with the federal government now, that the federal government's role is to be the benevolent uncle and hand us stuff.
Yes, the old will one Australian be disadvantaged? That sort of nonsense.
Yeah.
Look, there are budgetary pressures that Jim Chalmers has. I mean, fiscal policy is almost incapable of dealing with some of the economic pressures, particularly around inflation at the moment. You can really only overheat it by spending. But I think this particular plan, raising job seeker for the over 55s, my view is you either do it or you don't, and forget about age groups.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, but I can see their argument for doing it this way. But I'm not sure I agree with the argument, but I can certainly see it.
Yeah. Okay. Now moving on to the voice, Jack. The select committee was gifted the presence of a number of significant individuals, and the last man on the roster was none other than Tony Abbott. And I'd suggest to you, as a principle, Jack, anything that Tony Abbott says is a bad idea is probably a good one.
Yeah, well, I think that the days when Tony Abbott was an influential political figure died the day he couldn't hold his own seat in a federal election.
He seems to have forgotten about that, hasn't he? He seems to have cast that into the decent recesses of his memory. And Noel Pearson also made an interesting comment that if the no vote got up, reconciliation would be in fact dead forever. Bold stuff, I suppose. YouGov poll released over the weekend, I think, for the news, for the nine organisation, Jack. 51, 34 and 15. That's 51 yes, 34 no, 15 don't know. And they didn't allocate the don't knows. But as a general principle, you would say the don't knows, the majority of which would be headed towards the no vote, wouldn't you, Jack?
Yeah, I would think that's probably right. Yes.
Yeah, but even if we say we whip 1/3 of the no vote and into the yes camp, it does look reasonably promising. I think a lot of this polling depends on methodology, depends on the way it's taken, depends on the questions asked. But as it stands, the yes proposition leads in all states, does not have the majority in Queensland or Western Australia yet, just 47 in Queensland, I think WA 48, 52 in Northern Territory with 32% no, 53 and 52 in New South Wales and Victoria, Jack. Those are fairly low figures for mine in those two states, the two major states, two most populous states.
What does it actually need? It needs a majority of the electors voting, the Constitution says.
And it must win 4 states. You don't count the territories.
Yeah. Where I think, my view of it hasn't changed, that I think it's only about a 40% chance of succeeding. In fact, I think it'll fail. And that's because on the polling numbers, I think we are at the do you support Indigenous recognition in the Constitution stage of the public's deliberations. And one thing the Select Committee showed us that even on the yes proponents, there are 2 quite distinct interpretations of what the current proposal means. One I call the Megan Davis line, that's Professor Megan Davis, and the other one I call the Anne Toomey line. And the Megan Davis line is that the voice can speak to almost anybody in government, and that the government's going to have to listen. The Anne Toomey line is that's not the case at all, and she's supported by the Solicitor General, all that sort of stuff. Now, ultimately, the High Court will determine which of those interpretations is correct, and I think that the uncertainty about what the High Court will do with that is likely to lead the voice to fail.
Yeah, okay. We obviously disagree about this, and just on that the basic question of whether the yes vote will get up, I think there's much to be played out in terms of appealing to the sentiment of Australians. I don't think too many people are going to be wondering about constitutional arguments as they enter the polling booths, which are contentious and contended by various players. But the overwhelming majority of Australia's jurists, significant jurists, seem to suggest that this offers nothing in particular that is gravely going to affect how our government operates. I did notice Frank Brennan yesterday addressing the committee, saying that he wishes that the executive be removed from that the voice itself would not be able to speak and make recommendations to the executive. I find that odd. I really do.
No, precisely what he said was he wants the word executive replaced with ministers of state.
That's right. That's right. And look, that might make some sense. You're absolutely right about that. He didn't say just remove the executive and be done with it. The business of policy in Australia is not generated by the parliament for the most part. The business of government and what legislation and what actions governments take, often with parliamentary approval, more often than not with parliamentary approval, generate in the minister's doors, generate within the cabinet. And so I think this idea that we cut the executive out, that the voice not be able to advise the executive, it is really just, we would really be dipping deeply into the symbolic there.
Well, what he's saying is it would go to cabinet when it was a minister of state. That would give the voice the right to make submissions to cabinet, to a minister of state. But what it wouldn't do was allow the voice. It wouldn't give the voice as of right representation to individual public servants, statutory authorities, etc., etc.
Okay. So would that be a model you would support?
I haven't come to a fixed view about it. I mean, I'm still looking at the process. I mean, the process is wrong, in my view. They've spent 6 years talking to 5% of the population and 6 weeks talking to 95% of the population. And I think that's just wrong. They need to slow down and bring people on board with whatever it is they're arguing.
We've still got a long way to go. I mean, the legislation required to establish a referendum, I believe the Constitution dictates that once a referendum question is put and passes through the Parliament, then we have 60 days from that point on. So that legislation hasn't even entered the Parliament yet.
Yes, well, it has. It's just sitting on the floor floor of the House while the select committee.
Well, it hasn't been voted on.
That's right.
And when it is,
and it's got to be put within not less than 2 nor more than 6 months is the constitutional ruling.
Right.
But at the moment, I just don't think it will succeed. Yeah.
All right. Polling says otherwise, but there is a big don't know factor there, and if the majority of those don't knows, if this poll is correct, that is, vote yes, then vote no instead of yes, then we are looking at a very narrow victory on that polling. Just on that polling alone, we are looking at a very narrow victory with the possibility of Queensland and Western Australia failing, but I believe all other states would pass.
Getting the 4 up. I also think that at the moment the government seems to be adopting a take it or leave it. This is the option. We're not really interested in changing it, and a lot of the yes proponents have the same view. And I think if you run that line, people are going to say, "Okay, we'll leave it."
Yeah, well, that might be the mentality, but what is driving the government, what is driving Albanese's position, what is driving Bernie's position is the undertakings that they've made to Indigenous Australians, and I think it would be a profound betrayal if they changed their minds on that.
I certainly understand that's their political difficulty, if you like, but this has got to have support from a wide range of people. The Constitution belongs to all of us. You're not going to get it up by arguing on a take it or leave it basis. The argument is that we should be grateful that anyone's made us an offer. 95% of the people are going to look at that and go, no.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think a lot of the rulings on referenda in this country are in the deep unknown. A lot of the, shall we say, the established truths around referenda in this country in the deep unknown. This is the longest period we've had since our last referendum, over 24 years, and some of the established rules that where referenda either got up or got knocked over, and the majority of them got knocked over, are in deep historical Australia, a different Australia. Moving on, Jack, the ABC in a little bit of turmoil, particularly around its radio broadcasting. I think a lot of this is driven by some pretty poor ratings figures in New South Wales. I'm not sure where the rest of the country is in terms of
not much better elsewhere. I had a quick look at this, and of course that's true. It's like when you're making money; they'll forgive a lot of sins when you're making money in business, and in radio, if your ratings are through the roof, they're not going to look at how you're going about it or what you're doing so much. They're just pleased to get the ratings up. But when the ratings go down, everyone gets scrutiny. It's like when the profits go down, everyone gets scrutiny.
Yeah, but I mean, look, the first thing to say is that the ABC isn't ratings bound. I mean, obviously it pays attention to them, but it is not, it's not based on some sort of commercial notion of being able to sell advertising around its audience numbers. But
they all know the numbers.
Oh, they all know the numbers. There's no doubt about that. And Richard Glover, who's been a perennial at the ABC on Drive throughout New South Wales, has had some pretty poor ratings in the last couple of surveys. And James Valentine, who was on afternoons for a very long time, has moved to breakfast. And he's got figures around about the 7th percentile, normally ABC in the low double figures at that particular time. When my old mate Wendy Harmer was doing it, that's where they were. I guess I have to ask the question, Jack, who's listening to radio these days? I mean, you get on a train in Australia, or indeed a bus, and everyone's got the earphones in, but I guarantee you there aren't a lot of people listening to radio on them. They'll be listening to their music. Sometimes they're watching television shows.
They'll be listening to us.
And listening to podcasts, of course. The democratisation of radio, Jack. I'm not sure that. I mean, look, you threw this in as a topic for us. James Madden, who's the boss of media at the Australian, has said that one factor being considered by the 9-person advisory group, which is reviewing in the ABC what's going on, is the failure to recruit fresh talent from outside the taxpayer-funded giant, which has left its airwaves dominated by ABC lifers, according to a well-placed source. I get the argument, but if you look at commercial radio, you find the same thing. I mean, Ray Hadley's been on radio for a million years. Alan Jones recently retired deep into his 80s. There's very little fresh blood coming through in commercial radio as well.
The highest rating breakfast show in the country is run by an old mate of mine, and he's been doing it since the 80s, but he has gone through, I think he's on his third co-host now, Ross Campbell, as I knew.
That's in Melbourne, yes. I was wondering where you're going there. Oh, Ben Fordham's relatively young, and good bloke, Ben, by the way. I know him quite well, and he's going very well in his surveys. Started slowly because of the Jones factor, I suppose. But I'm just not sure about rating surveys, Jack, and the methodology there. it shows that a lot, in the end, what you're looking at, the ratings are talking about literally tens of thousands of people rather than millions.
Yeah, you still want to still want to have a high percentage rather than a low percentage. Look, I think James Madden makes some fair points that so much of ABC content sounds the same. There's not enough diversity of views within it. So what does that lead to? It leads to dull media, and dull media is a turn-off.
Look, I got a number of mates in the ABC, did a little bit of work for them a couple of years ago, didn't, not for my mates, but for the ABC. I was on a limited or short-term contract with them. Didn't enjoy the experience at all. I found the atmosphere was pretty cloying. I found that a number of people who'd been sort of shipped off into sort of podcast creation had come from the news departments, and they in turn were sort of looking at their longevity in media and were keen to, and I'll be very careful with my words here, keen to make a name for themselves. And a lot of that is driven by, the cuts that were imposed on the ABC over a long period of time. Some of these people that I work with were working, 3/16 of a week and all this sort of stuff, and they were desperate to get that tenure, to become one of those long-standing members. Yeah, become a lifer, and in order to do so, and I'll be very cautious with my words, Jack. In order to do so, were keen to make a name for themselves to the point, perhaps, where journalism had perhaps lost its not its principles, but they were making a lot of things that just didn't go well. That I didn't think were designed for to maximise an audience, and telling stories, telling funny stories, was essentially why I came while I was on board with them. But these funny stories were tortured to within an inch of their lives when the final product came out, and it was a bit disappointing, to be honest.
Comedy by committee is a hard thing to pull off.
Yeah, it is indeed. But when we talk about radio, Jack, the Sandilands wedding took place over the weekend. I barely knew this was going on. This is how little I keep an eye on these sorts of things. But Sandilands was married in the eastern suburbs.
At Swifts at Darling Point, the big house that I think was bought by the Morans.
Yeah, up that way. Darling Point, definitely. I did see some of the footage, and I noticed some of my old stamping ground there when you'd walk towards the pub in Double Bay. He apparently spent $1 million on the wedding, at least. The cake was worth 10 grand. He's got plenty of money, so why, you can certainly do this himself. But the big question for a lot of people was the appearance by the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. And there certainly were some colourful characters at the wedding, Jack, including John Ibrahim. I think he was a groomsman. A colourful history in and around the cross. I don't think he's ever been charged successfully with a criminal offence. He's certainly never been in jail. And another groomsman was sort of pimping himself around, or pimping the girls around in limos at one particular point. And there they all were, rubbing shoulders with the Prime Minister and the Premier of New South Wales, Chris Minns. Not a good look, I'd suggest, Jack.
Yeah, politicians seem to like doing this sort of thing.
I don't get it. I mean, is this like, is Kyle Sandilands the new Alan Jones, where everyone has to kowtow to him?
I don't know. I've got to confess I've never listened to Kyle Sandilands.
I haven't spent a lot of time either, but we know that he's a controversial figure who's made some fairly odd statements over the journey, but it's more like the company you keep. And I know he wins rating surveys after rating surveys, and we get back to this idea that we're really only dealing with tens of thousands of people rather than millions. And Albo, when asked, well, at a press conference, a public housing advocate interrupted Albo's presser and said, "Let's talk about housing, Prime Minister." And Albanese said, "I think you've had your say." That was, well, not much of a say. And he shut it down and talked about how excited he was to attend Kyle Sandland's wedding. "I enjoy weddings," Albo said. "We all do." But I didn't think it was. If I'd been advising the Prime Minister, Jack, I would have said no.
Yeah, but it seems to be the fashion to do this sort of thing these days.
Don't understand it. I mean, what's what's the downside here? That Kyle will give you a touch up on FM radio?
I could never see that with the fear of Alan Jones. I could never make sense.
I could
of that
never figure that out either. When Bob Carr had basically a small army of people and a junior minister attached to, they'd have to just get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and turn on the radio and sit in the office and make them. And if there was anything that Jonesy said that was remotely critical of the Carr government, they'd go into panic mode. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm with Albo. I enjoy weddings so much so I've had two myself.
There you go, Jack. There you go, indeed. The NDIS, Jack, is setting targets the answer to the reform of it, or does it need to be completely redesigned?
Yeah. Well, what I found most interesting about all the coverage of this is that the expensive consultants who were engaged to help design this had the belief that it would be self-funding, that people would go on the NDS for a short time. This would fit them up to return to work, and they would go back to work, and the government would get tax income from them, and that would fund the NDIS. And they thought they would have at most a couple 100,000 people on it, and they would kind of cycle through. In fact, they're up to 500,000 now and on their way to 800,000 in the next couple of years, because people, once they get on it, don't get off it.
Well, there's that, but there are all sorts of ways of looking at this thing. So with the NDIS, people who were full-time carers for people with disabilities are now able to get into the workforce. So there is a benefit there, although it's extremely difficult to measure. I mean, that was one of the selling points of the NDIS, that people involved in permanent care who had no other employment options available to them are now finding their way into employment. And those things are difficult to measure, but those things are occurring. I'd suggest if you want to look at making the NDIS affordable into the long-term future, and we've talked about this, you've got to kill the fraud. You've got to kill it off, and you've basically got to make prosecutions, and you've got to put people away.
That's probably right. I'm not sure you've got to jail people, but you certainly got to prosecute. You've got to isolate and discover the fraud in the first place. But there are bigger problems than this. I think something like 10% of primary school age boys are now on NDIS. They're the biggest growing number, is young kids who are being diagnosed as autistic.
Diagnosed on the spectrum. And what we have there, Jack, is a particular pressure in the way. And we're not talking about there being more autistic children than there were in the past, but we are talking about the ability to diagnose autism at a particular age that simply wasn't around even 10 years ago. Even the most caring parents were just simply unaware, and when we're talking about visits to neurologists and so forth, the determination on autism often wouldn't occur until the child had almost moved into the teens. And that's changing now. A lot of people say, why is there so much autism about? And this, in fact, drives a lot of the anti-vax rhetoric, which is complete nonsense, of course. But what we have now is a much earlier diagnosis of autism, of people on the young children on the spectrum, and we're also seeing, and this is sort of supports what you're saying about the NDIS, that with the right kind of therapy, the right kind of support, that they're actually, by the time they hit their secondary school ages, and I know of a couple of friends of mine who have kids on the spectrum, that they're actually engaging with people in an integrated environment, and they go on from there to study and work and do what everyone else does.
Yeah. When I was a kid, we just thought they were boys and therefore ratbags. Huh?
Well, we just didn't know. I mean,
But that's right. We didn't know.
It's not really a joke. We'd see certain kids. I remember one kid at school in particular, clearly on the spectrum when I think about it now, and the kid was bullied, to within an inch of his life. It was a terribly tragic sort of thing. And the school didn't know what to do, and his parents didn't know what to do. And in the end, it was just an awful situation that he's probably still suffering from.
Yeah, every school most classes had a kid like that, or to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, let's get rid of the fraud. That's the starting point, isn't it? Let's get rid of the fraud. Let's take that sugar off the table, make some prosecutions, and if people are really rorting the system, chuck a few of them behind bars. That's my answer. That'll save you at least $6 billion, according to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission.
Yeah, I think what generally happens with these sort of situations is the consultants they bring in have a kind of way too sunny understanding of people's honesty. All right, now definitely up your alley here, Jack, is the migration review. It was called by Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill last year. Former Public Service Chief Martin Parkinson led the review, and it made the case for wholesale reform to the migration system to prevent Australia becoming a nation of permanently temporary residents. The 200-page report proposes changes to the skilled migration program, student visas and employer-sponsored visas, and outlines the steps needed to ensure Australia can reap the opportunities and navigate the challenges that arise over the next 2 decades. What are your thoughts about it, Jack? Well, from time to time, the migration system does need a kind of a root and branch referral. What tends to happen is over the shorter period is the governments of both persuasions will fix one problem, and they do fix that problem or lessen that problem, but you get an accumulation of other problems. So that's right. So it's a highly bureaucratic system. Yep. And if you take away some of the bureaucracies, then you'll replace them with others. Yes, that's correct. So every now and again, you've got to say, well, look, this has just all gotten too complex because we've made it more complex by fixing a particular problem. Now we've got to go back and sort of start again and say, this is how we're going to redesign it. And that will have some problems when you do that because it is necessarily complex. But it does need this from time to time. At this stage, we've seen the report. We really don't know what the government's going to do with it. Yes. We'll find out in due course. Yes, Claire O'Neill has said that she will respond in due course. Just one other thing, Jack. The government announced just last week that it is fast-tracking citizenship for a number of people who've been in the country for a long time, encouraging people to become citizens. All that's good news, isn't it, Jack? It is. Generally speaking, good news, yeah. All right. May Day, public holiday for you. Just before we leave migration, it's awfully hard to design a system that covers everybody and doesn't leave any holes, right? Yeah. That doesn't leave any, that doesn't leave cases that are difficult to deal with, right? And traditionally what's happened is in Australia is that a bit of ingenuity has been used to fix those handful of cases that are causing a problem. Separate visa categories, these sorts of things, yeah. So we need it to be simplified, don't we, Jack? But we don't want to create those holes at the same time. Yeah, but if you write the thing for the great majority of people, you can cause problems for a small group. So it's kind of hard to do both things together. Well said. All right. Now, as I was on my way to saying, you enjoyed the benefits of a May Day holiday. We don't do it in Australia. We think it's communism. But, of course, France had its May Day
International Workers' Day public holiday, and it was on for young and old, Jack.
Well, France has a tradition dating at least back until 1968 that the 1st of May is an occasion for the coppers to wade into a few people and belt their heads, and for the protesters to pick up cobblestones and throw them at the cops.
It was on for young and old yesterday. A real Donnybrook around the country. At least 108 police officers have been injured. A large number of police wounded was extremely rare, adding that 291 people had been arrested during the unrest. No figures, interestingly enough, on how many protesters were injured. It's just not clear on that.
Have you seen the way the Parisian?
They don't mess around, do they? I mean,
No.
water cannon. I mean, I know it's used in a lot of countries, but water cannon, certainly in Australia, stopped because it's just way too dangerous. I mean, once you hit with a jet of water at that sort of rate, you can just tumble into anything and end up being seriously injured or indeed killed. But in France, and I think still you do see, I think in Belgium they still roll out the water cannon. I don't think they do in the UK. We certainly don't here. South Korea, who probably know better than just about anybody on how to deal with student protesters over the years. I think they've probably still got the water cannon. They often use dyes, Jack, so they can round people up later if they've got a bit of blue or red dye on them.
Yeah, that happened during the protests here a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we haven't used water cannon. The last water cannon vehicle in New South Wales was donated to the fire brigade, Jack. So we haven't used that.
I think we have 3 here in Hong Kong.
Right. Oh, you're talking about the Hong Kong protests. Yes, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about freedom marches here. Yes, they donated it to the fire brigade here, which probably does a bit more use. But yes, it's still. Prime Minister Elizabeth Bourne said she tweeted that the violence was unacceptable. The Interior Ministry put the overall number of demonstrators at 782,000, including 112,000 in Paris. The unions say the figure was closer to 3 million, Jack, but still 800,000 people on the streets. That's a big number.
Yeah, but it's a big day in France. That's like I say, it's a bit like
Bit of
Grand
history,
Final
bit
Day
of
or Cup
tradition.
Day. Yeah.
Bit like the Anzac Day Collingwood v Essendon clash here, but with a little bit more colour and fury,
And no jumper punching. It's the real deal. Yeah.
That's right, yeah, indeed. They don't mess around in France, and God love them too. You don't get when Australians get a bit annoyed, they sit around and moan on the couches. But when the French get annoyed, it's off to the streets to throw a few cut lunches and whatever else comes to hand. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine, Jack, the White House believes that more than 20,000 Russian combatants have died in the battle for the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut in the last 5 months, which is still ongoing, by the way. I mean, more soldiers have died there from both sides than actually existed in the city before the war or the invasion began. So Americans are saying declassified intelligence says that a further 80,000 Russians have been wounded, so 100,000 taken out of commission. Russia has lost an estimated 5 men for every Ukrainian soldier its forces have killed in the battle for Bakhmut, according to a NATO official. Now, that's disputed by the Donetsk People's Republic, which is a Russian puppet government, and they put the Ukrainian casualties at 5 times higher. I'd suggest, Jack, the answer is somewhere in between. But Russia is losing a lot of people, and losing a lot of army, and most of them are coming from that Wagner mercenary group, Jack.
Yeah.
Well, it's notorious for its inhumane methods, and it's getting to the point where its leader, one of the worst people on the planet, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's basically staked his reputation over the battle of Bakhmut, staked his reputation over that, and is now sort of talking about pulling the pin and walking away. In a rare in-depth interview with a prominent Russian or pro-Russian war blogger, he vowed, that's Prigozhin, vowed to withdraw Wagner fighters if they are not provided with much-needed ammunition by the Russian Defence Ministry. Wagner fighters, this is chilling, could be redeployed to Mali, he warned. He has often clashed with Russia's Defence Ministry during the war, accusing officials of not providing his fighters with enough support. This is from a BBC report, by the way. Prigozhin also called upon the Russian media and military leadership to stop lying to the Russian population ahead of an expected Ukrainian spring counteroffensive. We need to stop lying to the Russian population, Prigozhin said, telling them everything is all right. And he praised the Ukrainian military's good, correct military operations and command. He'd be due for a fall down the stairs, wouldn't he, Yevgeny? With that sort of talk?
Yeah.
Well, they can't win Bakhmut if Wagner pulls out. Simply, they just get that would be just a killing zone for the Russian army.
Yeah.
Interesting. We are very much in that mode in the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have reached a sort of a stalemate on that eastern front, and it remains to be seen how, now that we're getting well and truly into the European spring, has been a cool, mild spring so far, certainly in Eastern Europe. Just how it's all going to go when the weather finds up and the ground gets hard.
Yes.
We'll wait.
I don't think anyone really knows.
We'll wait and see on that, but certainly some huge figures there. That would take Russian deaths up to around about 120,000, Jack. Since the invasion, significant figure. All right. I came across this. Someone I think had tweeted it up, so I went and had a look at it. The Australian government has issued a travel warning to the United States, Jack, which now includes this: violent crime is more common than in Australia. Gun crime is also prevalent. If you live in the US, learn and practice active shooter drills. That's the Australian government advice to people travelling, Australians travelling to the US and living there. And it comes in the wake of a spree shooter who is now on the run in Texas. As we discovered, the man on the run, after killing 5 people, 5 of his neighbours, including children, had been deported at least 4 times, Jack.
Can I just say, the Australian government travel warnings, I can remember reading them about Hong Kong during our year and a half or so of protests here, and I didn't recognise the city I lived in.
Oh, look, I understand that, and lots of travellers who are intrepid and kind of fearless. I follow one on Instagram, and he pops over to Iraq, and he goes to places in Western Africa that the Australian government says, please don't go there. They might be a little bit more cautious, Jack, because it's then their job to try and pull people out who get pinched in some of these very, very dangerous places. I'm not suggesting for a moment that America is, but this is a real problem. I mean, spree shootings have been a problem for a long time, but this man on the run, his name is Francisco Oropeza. He was deported, Jack, 4 times, kept coming over the border. He killed 5 of his neighbours, including a child, after someone said, can you please stop shooting your AR-15? He jacked up and stormed into the house and shot the place up.
On the porch having a shoot, and the next door neighbour said, look, my kid's trying to sleep.
My 1-year-old kid is trying to sleep, and he took umbrage and then charged into the house. It's a terrible, terrible story. I hope they catch up with Francisco Oropeza as we record this. He is still on the run. he basically, I think most people, when we say talking about storming him in, storming into the house, he had a hype-out rifle, an AR-15 semi-automatic, and just kept shooting into the house. We would like to think that he'll end up with a bit of high-caliber therapy at some point in the very near future, Jack.
Is Texas still doing the death penalty? I can't recall.
Death penalty in Texas?
Yeah.
You better believe it, Jack. I mean, Texas, it's a great Simpsons line when Maggie Simpson is found to be the one culpable of shooting Mr. Burns, and the joke is, no one would ever charge a 4-year-old girl with murder, and then there's a pause. He goes, maybe Texas. Very much a death penalty there. The worst thing that could happen is he flees to Mexico, or God knows he can't be tumbled over the border again. He'll either be shot dead by police or he will be taken into custody, and the death penalty would be on the table there without doubt. Now, Jack, we know, and we discussed last week, that Joe Biden is having another run, and he'll be as old as Anton Chernenko when he becomes president, if he's elected in 2024. But of course, one of the things, and I'm glad you pointed this out here, this actually places greater emphasis on the role of Kamala Harris now, because the vice president is literally a heartbeat away from the White House, Jack.
Yeah, Van Jones, who was an official in the Obama administration and is now a commentator on CNN, said this on the CNN the other day. She's in such an unusual position. She's a woman, she's black, she's Asian, and she's running alongside the oldest person to ever do it. So she's essentially running for president. That's what she's doing, and I think that people understand that.
So she has to lift her game, doesn't she? Because if Biden is to be re-elected, it will be as much an endorsement of her as him. That's probably,
Yes.
that might be overstating a little bit, but she because of his age, she has to be seen as a viable proposition as a president in the event where Joe Biden may become incapacitated.
Yeah, this is a small problem for the Democrats because it's hard to make her seem like a viable candidate for president. First of all, the number one mark against her is that she's a Californian.
It always is for Democrats, just for our listeners, just to explain that Californian Democrats, and indeed New England Democrats, Jack, a little bit like Joe, tend not to find favour among Democrat voters or indeed independent voters in those states where presidential elections are won, the Midwest, the Southwest, to name, the two those are the areas where elections are won, including places like Pennsylvania and most recently Georgia. So yes, that's a big job for her. You said she was making sense last week, Jack.
She was, yes, only briefly, but she was making sense for 2 or 3 minutes.
Moment of clarity. Big job for her. I've got to ask, Jack, who would be Donald Trump's running mate?
I don't think he's going to get the nomination, so I don't think it's going to matter.
But he's going to have to name someone, surely, at some point. He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to until the RNC, the convention. Yeah. But and if he gets that far, but it's an intriguing question. It is a bit of fantasy footy, but who would it be? It's not going to be Mike Pence, you wouldn't reckon?
No, it's certainly won't be Mike Pence. You can say that for sure. Who wants to kill their career is the answer.
Okay. Well,
I mean, if you're a young up-and-coming politician, they're the people who are normally keen to get the vice presidential nomination. Not always, but quite often. Dick Cheney was happy to take it with George W. Bush, and he knew he was never going to become president.
He was the president, really. Well, Cheney was really He was really the boss.
But generally speaking, it's a an Al Gore or someone who sees this as a stepping stone to the presidency. But if you take the vice president's job to or become the vice presidential candidate with Donald Trump, you're basically killing your career stone dead, I would think.
Fair point. I'm just trying to think who might have a crack with him. It's bound not to be someone from Florida because I think that's already done. So you're looking at someone in the Midwest. God knows. I mean, maybe Melania might pick someone off the telly and then get blamed for it by her husband. Yeah. Might get some sort of grifter there. Just to finish off there, Van Jones.
It wouldn't be a Chris Christie, for instance. He won't do it.
Oh, Christie, not a lot of love there, mate. Not a lot of love there between he and the Trumpster these days.
And Chris Christie would make a pretty handy vice presidential candidate, I think, but he won't do it.
I think he might go okay in the primaries. I don't think he'll go deep. I don't think he'll go that deep into the primaries, but I think Christie, who hasn't yet nominated, but may well, might be a bit of a sticking point for both for Trump and RDS. But
he's a politician. He's a politician of substance, not just physical substance, but he's a politician of some substance.
He's a substantial human being physically, but he's also pretty good on his feet, oddly enough. Just to wrap that up from Van Jones on CNN, who has that sort of insider knowledge, he says of Kamala Harris, she is a decent person, but she's a drag on the ticket. I just had that going. No, this is the host of the show.
This is the host of the show. I can't recall his name.
Harris is a decent person, but she's a drag on the ticket. I just had the conversation with Van Jones. Well, we know it's not Van Jones. I think she has got to up her game, or that will end up being the case. We did see the White House Correspondents' Dinner with President Biden brandishing the aviators. And gave a pretty good account of himself, Jack. Not that he's quite funny.
He was okay. I can't imagine why you'd want to go, but still.
I think he sort of handled it pretty well, but it seems that he's being very, very carefully media managed these days, and the press secretary there is basically organising the questions in advance so he can answer them in advance, Jack.
Yes, which is embarrassing for the journalist in question. I think it was an Agence France press photographer managed to get a clip of the card that President Biden was holding in his hand, and it had the name of the journalist who he was to ask the first question of, had her name plus a phonetic spelling so he could get that right, and it had not quite the exact, but pretty much the first question she was going to ask. And he had that in his hand. So he goes to her and gives her a name, and she asks the question, and he's already got the question in his hand. And that looks awfully embarrassing for the journalist and for the news organisation. LA Times she worked for.
Yeah, what I'm going to say is that's excellent work from Biden's press secretary, by the way. That's excellent work. But from a journalistic point of view, it's really not the way it should be.
And excellent work from the photographer to pick it up.
yeah. So there you go. A little embarrassing.
Joe's best line at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was to say that, okay, that's me done. I've spoken for 10 minutes. I won't be asking any questions. I'm going to leave. And the White House correspondents thought that was hilarious. But my view of that was Joe wasn't laughing with you. He was laughing at you because you put up with this.
Yeah, look, it's always that way, though. I mean, Obama put in a couple of fantastic performances there at the correspondents' lunch, including one correspondents' dinner, including one where he absolutely baked Donald Trump, who sat there rather sullenly. I don't remember Trump ever turning up to it. I think he flicked it.
He they cancelled it when he was the president. Actually, the funniest performance I ever saw there was from Laura Bush.
Yeah, she was terrific, giving her husband George W. a bit of a slapping. Yes. Doesn't get up early, or gets to bed pretty early at night.
Yeah. No, if anything happens after 9 o'clock, George will be in bed.
That's right. I think it was W who said to her, I want to be better regarded as a president. She said, well, stay up a few hours.
You're going to have to stay up later, George,
Meanwhile, Jack, RDS has been on the whirlwind tour of Europe to, shall we say, mixed reviews. British business chiefs that DeSantis spoke to at a high-profile London event last week on Friday described it as a tired performance, horrendous, low wattage, and like the end of an overseas trip. One UK business figure said DeSantis looked bored and stared at his feet as he met with titans of British industry in an event co-hosted by Lloyd's of London. A second business figure who was in the room said it was a low wattage performance and that nobody in the room was left thinking, this man's going places. Ouch. They said it felt really like a bit like we were watching a state-level politician. I wouldn't be surprised if those in attendance came out thinking, that's that guy, that's not the guy.
Yeah, who knows? But to be honest, if you'd put Ronald Reagan in that room, they would have come out and said, well, he's dumb. They would have said the same thing about George W. Bush, and they won twice. And none of these people will get a vote. DeSantis is in an extraordinarily strong position at this stage to be polling in front of the sitting president when he hasn't even announced his candidature and he's still just a state governor. Is a pretty remarkable statistical blip. Now, whether that follows through, who knows? But he's travelling as well as you could expect him to be.
Well, there's another big issue in the United States, and we're going to look at the United States first and their issues with homelessness, but we're going to expand that into a more of a global discussion and look at some of those countries, and one in particular that's done very, very well. But the reason we are talking about homelessness is that Democrats in the Oregon House of Representatives have introduced a bill that would decriminalise homeless encampments in public places and allow homeless people to sue for $1,000 if they're harassed or told to leave. This bill was proposed by two state representatives, both Democrats, in and around the Portland area, and they're talking about decriminalisation of homelessness. It seems to me, Jack, there is a very profound issue of homelessness in Australia. There is a very profound issue of homelessness in the United States. This particular bill put forward by state Democrats in Oregon is really just tinkering with the problem.
Yes.
It doesn't really address
I think there are different homelessness issues in different places. That's certainly true.
Well, it's not as if it's an issue that can't be solved. And this is why I wanted to talk about what the Finns have done and what you have to do in order to solve problems of homelessness. If we look at the Finnish model, it's the only country in Europe where homelessness is falling, but it's not done because of some fly-by-night policy arrangement. It's a long-term commitment that the Finns have made. In the United States, homelessness, that is people sleeping rough on the streets, it's around 1% of the population. That's a staggering number. The Finns have got homelessness at less than 1/10 of that. And there's lots of reasons why they've been successful. They built houses, not temporary shelters. So when we look back at the Democrats here, what they're talking about is let's make it lawful for people to sleep rough. Now that's really just not addressing the substantial issues. And the issue is, Jack, around homelessness, the answer, unsurprisingly, is homes, providing homes, not temporary accommodation.
I think that's the issue for some aspects of the homelessness situation, not all.
Well, it's what the Finns have done, and it's been going on now for 15 years. So it's not as if it's a policy that they made 2 years ago and they're looking at solid figures. ever, in that short period of time. This is something that's been going on. Firstly, they addressed and continue to address the issue of affordable housing in Finland, and that's a big thing. These are red hot issues. I'd argue that this is probably the biggest issue that's facing the Albanese government right now is affordable housing in Australia, and the spin-off effect of that is homelessness. Housing First in Finland, their goal was, and this is going back to 2008, was to create 2,500 new homes, and it has created 3,500. Rough sleeping has all been but eradicated in Helsinki, and the only temporary shelter left is a 50-bed temporary accommodation. The other people who found themselves in homelessness have found themselves in homes. Often, some people have stayed there for 7 or 8 years. Some people have lived in these homes for a year or two and then moved out, got back on their feet and then moved out. That they do have laws like they ban alcohol consumption and they ban drug consumption in Finnish public housing. And they also must pay rent, and they also must consult with people appointed by the government to assist them. The Finns have spent €250 million creating new homes and hiring 300 extra support workers. But overall, when you address, well, it's €250 million, a lot of money for a smallish country like Finland. What they've seen is that there is an economic bounty that goes along with it. That once you substantially resolve the problem of homelessness, the savings in emergency health care, the justice system, in social services, as much as sort of €15,000 per every homeless person. So these things, one, are solvable, two, are beneficial, overall in economic and financial terms. So why isn't Australia dealing with this issue, firstly, of affordable housing and then the issue of homelessness? We're seeing figures, sharp rises among women in their late middle ages, becoming homeless. Firstly, we need to address the issue of affordable housing, and then we need to develop and throw some money into creating homes for people who are homeless, not shelters.
Let's look at it in 3 cities first in Americas. We started with Portland, San Francisco, LA are the 3 most biggest homelessness populations, right? And there is absolutely zero will. They're all progressive run cities, and there's zero will for the sort of policies that you're talking about in Finland. The tough love, that is, we'll build you a house, but no drugs, no booze, etc., etc. There's zero political will to do that because they don't want to. There's also zero will to build affordable housing. In fact, the progressives don't want affordable housing in their area because it's going to reduce their property values.
That's the problem we're facing in Australia too.
Yep.
And it's not necessarily a progressive one. I mean, I would argue that it's not. I mean, yes, you're highlighting 2 progressive states in Oregon and California, but this is part of the problem here. I actually think if the Albanese government doesn't start addressing issues of affordable housing, it runs the risk of just falling into the normal electoral cycles and being voted out of power. This is a very powerful issue for voters under the age of 40 and those above it, but predominantly those people who have found themselves cast out of the housing market because it is just not affordable for them to do so.
Yeah, we would have tried here in Hong Kong. It's even worse here, and it was one of the drivers of the protest movement 3 years ago. And And part of addressing it means that someone's got to take a bit of a hit, and that means existing homeowners will not enjoy the never-ending cycle of rising house values when you address this. But it has to happen.
It does have to happen, and what we need to avoid from happening, and I presume this is an issue in Hong Kong. I did see in the UK where a lot of housing development, apartment style development in West London was being marketed in Dubai and in Hong Kong and in other parts of the world where there's a lot of wealth, and these houses are being sold and then being left empty.
I would get 3 ads a week from London property developers.
Yeah. And look, I'm not suggesting that you would do this, but if you invested in it, you would probably only live there for a month a year.
No, I'd probably rent it out, to be quite honest. But yeah,
yeah, well, that might be solving the problem. But we have really big rental accommodation. I know the Greens have been on this. The Greens are calling for a rental freeze, and that's, again, that's very much like the sort of Democrat response in Oregon. You are dealing with the symptoms rather than solving the problem. The problem for many Australians is how to get into the housing market. I know the Albanese government just introduced a scheme where family members can pool together, friends can pool together to get deposits and apply for mortgages. God only knows how the mortgage vendors will see that. But the issue is more affordable housing. That's the first step in this, and you can do these things concurrently. But the other issue is you're throwing money into temporary accommodation is not the answer. You have to give people a home that they can call their own, and so they can get back on their feet. Yes, they can. Yes, they have to pay a small amount of rent. Yes, they have to behave themselves while they're in there in terms of consumption of alcohol and drugs. And yes, they have to continue a form of counselling as they go to basically get them prepared to enter back into the workforce. And then, with a little bit of luck, within a year or so, they can move out into and move into their own form of affordable housing. So we just don't seem to have any sort of strategy in this country, Jack, for dealing with this thing. I think it's the big issue for anyone under 40 in this country, and lots of people who are above it. And there is that clash, there inherent clash between those who own property, and often multiple properties, and those who have none. And that gulf is widening by the day, and it's become a really hot political issue, and will only get hotter.
Yeah, part of it is a planning issue. Where do you,
Yes.
People like their single family units, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want multiple unit dwellings.
Multiple dwellings on a property. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's something, I don't know what the last time you were down in Melbourne, you had a good drive around there. Something Melbourne has done a bit better than Sydney, and that is to have medium density housing, dual occupancy residences. Those things are encouraged far more by local government than they are, on my viewing of it, in Sydney, where people still live in their, even in the inner west, still live in sort of almost quarter-acre blocks, a single dwelling, housing two, 3, 4 people. The issue is you have to change that mentality, and I know there are a lot of big apartment blocks and so forth going up, but you need to encourage developers to create more dense residential properties, just on single pieces of land. I reckon this would be my step towards doing this, and the Albanese government, I think, if they are blind to this issue, or if they choose to ignore it, if they see it's too hard, I think they are in great peril. I would have a national conference on housing that involves all levels of government, where they sit down and start making some practical changes towards planning and development, where they devote enormous amount of public money, and it will require a lot of public money to build affordable housing, and you do so knowing that in those areas where you build this affordable housing, Jack, there are going to be people who have mortgaged, who are sitting on mortgages not far away, who have bought their homes. So there's going to be a lot of political friction over it, but they need to do this. Otherwise, I mean, I think it's this is one of the reasons why they were elected, and that was essentially because the previous government had done nothing. And if they don't address it, I think there's just profound problems coming their way. I'd also say that this building of affordable housing must go hand in hand with a response of using perhaps public buildings, renovating and refurbishing public buildings to create small and limited housing for people who are homeless, and that to me is a step in the right direction. I don't see too much in housing policy coming from the Albanese government that gives me any confidence that they're across this. They understand the threats in doing nothing.
It takes a little bit of political courage to do stuff like this, and that's not often in ready supply.
Yeah, that's right. But I think doing nothing is the worst of all of the options available to them. Now, Jack, ChatGPT has caught your eye, I see. ChatGPT, we did an entire episode written by ChatGPT, Jack, the conditional release program. And I've got to tell you that typing my name in there creates all manner of misinformation. Typing some of the books that I've written in there creates all sorts of misinformation. ChatGPT, when it doesn't know or seems uncertain, just seems to be comfortable lying.
Yes.
So why? I mean, look, we talked about the example where it might be of use, and I thought maybe if you're selling real estate and you put in virtual parameters around a particular house, particular dwelling, how many bedrooms, all that sort of stuff, you might find it'll write the copy for you pretty well. But here we're finding its way into medicine, Jack.
So it would seem. I have a better feeling for what it's doing in law, and it's there are not just ChatGPT, but there are a number of the big law and accounting firms have either bought licenses for similar artificial intelligence machines or developed their own.
Software,
and they are quite capable.
They're capable to a point.
These are quite capable.
I think if provided you give it the right instructions, if you wanted an examination, for example, I typed in Unholy Trinity and basically asked it to write not a review, but basically a preamble about the book, and it told me that it was co-authored by Dennis Ryan's son, Jared Ryan, who's actually a convicted pedophile, and that's not Dennis Ryan's son, by the way. That's just that it plucked this name, Jared Ryan. The only one I can think of is Vince that it coincided with was Vincent Jared Ryan, who was a convicted pedophile from up northern New South Wales, Newcastle Maitland. Very strange answers to some of these things. In fact, when I got around to putting the Fine Cotton Fiasco in there, it told me that Pat Shield wasn't the co-author, and it had been written by someone else entirely. It's a strange thing when it doesn't seem to know. It's great at writing benign sort of text, but if it doesn't know, it just lies.
Yeah. Well, I've watched it. I've watched a not ChatGPT, but another AI service or machine write a contract and do a really good job in no time at all. I mean, it is going to revolutionise the way law is practiced, and I have a fair bit of understanding of that.
Well, I can tell you, Jack, you want to have a pretty good look at that contract draft because it might throw some strange things in there. Now, very briefly, we just want to talk about, and we'll do a more expanded discussion here, but you wanted to address the issue of coal consumption for electricity generation in China, and it is growing, and that must be of concern to anyone about climate change. Now, you can talk about the rationale for it, but the simple fact of the matter is that China's consumption of coal for electricity generation is, well, basically, it is almost, well, it's almost 9 times that of what it was in 2019.
Yeah, it's growing faster than all the other people who are closing power stations put together.
Look, can I just simply say we can have this discussion? I know your position on climate change, but the simple reality and the things that you continue to point out are absolutely genuine, that the developing world is still consuming fossil fuel based energy at a rate that is basically rendering all sorts of renewables almost superfluous, Jack. So
yeah, the Chinese are building lots of renewables, but they're also trying to expand their economy further. So they're building lots of new power sources. And as I think it was the body called the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air noted that the technologies for storing clean energy are not yet mature enough to be deployed at the scale considered essential for China's plans to expand the use of renewable energy. That is, you can expand the new renewable energy. What you can't do is turn that into usable power on the scale that China requires.
Well, what they're talking about there is a carbon storage technology. That's essentially what they're talking about. And my understanding is that the technology of it does not exist at the moment.
No, they're not talking about carbon storage. They're talking about techniques to store renewable energy to make it available when you need it. And what they're saying is you can't do that on the scale that China requires. So China's got to build coal-fired power stations.
So we'll look at energy and the developing world in greater detail in our next episode, but the figures are pretty staggering, just in terms of consumption, Chinese consumption of coal in particular, to drive electricity, drive their economy and keep the lights on, and keep the lights on for a growing population. In sport, Jack, we have a new CEO at the AFL, Andrew Dillon. He'll take over, I believe. McLaughlin will remain in the chair until at least October, until the end of this season, and then Dillon will take over from that point on. Did you ever play in Victorian Amateur Football Association, Jack?
No, I did not.
I played 100-odd games in the VFA. Why didn't I get a game? Why didn't I get a Guernsey as CEO of the AFL? Seems to be the one thing you need to have done is play for an old boys team. McLaughlin was a player at the Uni Blues, and Dillon was
Uni
an
Blacks,
old Zabs. Uni Blacks.
Yep.
Blues, Blacks. I think the Blacks were the lower grade. And I thought he might have been a Blues player. He won about football apparently when he wasn't playing polo. And Dillon was, of course, with the old Zabs.
6 flags on the trot, wasn't it? At old Zabs.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Look, he's got much on his plate. I mean, as I say, he won't be in the chair for 6 months or so. But he's got the Hawthorn racism review fallout. That's still sort of bubbling away, and I don't know what they're going to do about that. And, of course, and we'll talk about this in a little while, a new team in Tasmania. We're not quite sure when they'll come on board. It wouldn't be next year, I don't think. But there will be a 19th side, and there will be a Tasmanian. They'd have to be the Tasmanian Tigers, wouldn't they, Jack? Or they can't be. Richmond will be most upset. What are they going to be? The Devils? They'll have to be the Devils.
Will this be like the battle over the Port and Collingwood on the stripy jumper?
They can't be the Tigers. There's 100,000 Richmond members hit the streets French style if that happened. And of course, with this new Tasmanian side, we wish Dylan, Mr. Dylan. All
I have a solution to that problem. I think it was Paddy McGuinness, famously at an ALP conference. They used to hold them down in Tasmania, and he was asking for a beer after having had a few. And you remember the Cascade bottles had the Tassie Tiger on it, on the front. And he says to the barman, "Give me a couple of those beers with the striped dogs on them, will you?" So they can call them the Tassie striped dogs, mate. Yeah.
Tassie striped dogs. Yeah, the Tassie thylacines doesn't really roll off the tongue. Now, Elbow's got involved here, and there was a bit of controversy about that in regard to homelessness. You've got a lot of people living in tents in Hobart. Rental crisis up the wazoo. In fact, Jack, on a review last weekend, there was not one property in Hobart up for rent. And there is a rental crisis there right now. So Elbows Optics are turning up in Hobart, announcing a 23,000 seat stadium. Was met with some controversy. I think overall Tasmanians would be approving of all of this. The problem I've got with this, Jack, is that Bellerive Oval holds 20,000 right now, and it hosts tests and T20s and ODIs and a few games of footy every year. Why isn't that good enough?
I suspect the reason why is that there has been an exponential growth in the quality of football stadiums. If you look at Adelaide Oval, Perth Stadium, all that sort of stuff, they are just so much better. People very much more enjoy going to them, and everyone wants one now.
Yeah, look, there's 23,000 seats compared to the 20. Yeah, Bellerive is, it's kind of
basic.
Regional ground, yeah, and the fact is, right now, Stadia have got about 25 years, and then they have to be replaced. There's talk of Marvel being replaced at some time fairly soon. It's been around for about that length of time,
and it's really a factor of. Stadiums were much the same for 100 years, with a few differences, but the design and the user experience is improving so quickly that people need to catch up.
Yeah, all right. Well, I presume it's going to be very popular in Tasmania. I think they'll be 2 or 3 seasons away from starting.
The real trick with the Tasmanian team is can you pull the whole state behind it, because there's a kind of a fair gap between the north and the northwest and the Hobart area. But can you pull them all together around a single team? I think they probably can, but that's going to take some work.
Need a lot of money to run a footy team, mate.
Yep.
It used to be about 10 million a season. Now you need about 30 or 40 before you even start thinking about profits. That's how much revenue you got to make. Some of it comes through broadcast rights, but a lot of it's driven by membership, merchandise sales, all that sort of stuff. I just, Collingwood have just come from nowhere, come from the clouds. They beat Adelaide by a few points, Jack. But did you see the game at all?
I did.
Did you see the umpiring?
It wasn't great.
There were just so many howlers, but the one that really caught my mind was the defender Murphy went to take a mark and got absolutely cleaned up from the front. No free kick paid. And while he was being assisted from the ground with blood streaming from his nose, Jordan De Goey basically was paddling the ball in front of him with the doctors holding up Fogarty, getting him off the ground. So Goey just let the ball go rather than have a collision with the doctors, and was paid a free kick for intentional out of bounds. Gee, there were some shockers, mate. Dane Swan, who was a Collingwood man and therefore entitled to be a bit biased, reckons umpire 19 needs to be investigated. All I'll say, Jack, is will umpire 19 get a gig next week? It'd be something to watch because it was terrible. So Collingwood won, so they don't have too many complaints. But the umpiring was, I don't know umpires on the field could have missed that. The number of umpires. What, they got 3 or 4 now? I can forget.
Half a dozen, I think.
Not counting boundary umpires.
What I think is most
missed that, staggering to me.
What I think is most remarkable about the AFL at the moment is how often Collingwood are coming back from a 3/4 time deficit and winning. I think they're
13
of the last 18 games they've played. About 15 of them have been decided by less than 2 goals, and they've won nearly all.
They've gone into 3/4 times, down on 13 occasions to win 10 times.
Yeah,
those are the stats.
And I've got to tell you, I've been watching footy for a hell of a long time. And the last team I can remember who were as good at this as coming back from a 3/4 time deficit was 1981 and 82, and it was your mob, Carlton, who were very, very good at it in those days.
It's a bloody good habit to have. And what's more, it makes the sides they play, if they're 3 or 4 goals in front, they're towing. They're nervous at 3/4 time because they know they're going to come at them. Look, a couple of takeaways from the round just completed. Melbourne, who are for mine the best side in it at the moment, gave North Melbourne a mother of a hiding, and Carlton smashed the West Coast Eagles, very much undermanned. We know they've got a long injury list, but some of the tackling pressure and physical pressure around the football are non-existent from the Eagles in the second half. And so we've got a bit of an uneven comp, Jack, and I suggest those two sides are uncompetitive at the moment.
Yeah, the bottom two, North and the Eagles, are pretty hopeless. But look, I think North, I'm not sure about the Eagles, but I think North are on the right track, but they've got a long way to go.
I think the Eagles the Eagles should have been rebuilding 3 seasons ago, and for some reason they didn't. And so they've got 2 to 3 years of pain ahead of them. North Melbourne perhaps a little bit less, but they're not at the moment not competitive. Meanwhile, Jack, in the NRL, it is a very competitive competition. The West Tigers, who are cellar dwellers, beat last year's premiers. And when you've got a competition like that, it tells you that if you even the better sides turn up and only sort of put in 95%, they're going to get beaten.
Yeah, and I could remember last time West Tigers won. So.
Oh, they've had a couple this year, but they are the cellar dwellers. But up they popped, and almost in defiance, you can almost name your own odds on them having a win. They beat last year's premiers. It's a sign of an even competition. I don't know that the AFL's got the same thing. Now, to take us out, Jack, we did have something from Ray. We did have a letter from Ray Baseman. G'day, Ray. I know you're listening. I will get onto it next week. He had a protest about something that I said about him. We'll get onto that, but we're running out of time, Jack, because, of course, we've got the coronation, and I know you'll be waiting with breath bated at the very thought, waving the flag.
Waving my little flag.
I know you'll be watching. Watch the whole damn thing. Goes for about 28 hours, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Betty's did. Betty's did. That went forever. Charles might be a little bit truncated, Jack, but what are we celebrating here?
Well, I just like this. It was from Associated Press, and I just love the writing for it. King Charles III lives in a palace, travels in a chauffeur-driven Bentley, and is one of Britain's richest men. But he's similar to many of his subjects in one very basic way. His family life is complicated, very complicated. There's a second wife, an embarrassing brother, and an angry son and daughter-in-law, all with allies who aren't shy about whispering family secrets in the ears of friendly reporters. I thought that was very good. And the last thing was from Q&A. We're recording this on the Tuesday, so it was Monday night. I saw it last night, and they were talking about, they're all very keen on banning vaping or restricting the sales of vaping.
I know, it's crazy. I don't get it. Yeah.
And they had the little strip on the bottom with the questions from the audience.
Yeah.
And I like this. It was from a school teacher who said, "The boys' toilets now smell like strawberries and watermelons." and seriously, they thought that was a downside. I got to say, you from boys' toilets in primary school, that would be an upside.
That is an improvement. I just simply want to say, if anyone wants to get into the coronation this weekend, perhaps you should just take a little bit of a look at what's his name, the Scottish comedian. Whoa, sorry, Frankie Boyles, who has got a thing out. You'll be able to check it out. It goes for about 50 minutes on YouTube. Frankie Boyles' Farewell to the Monarchy 2023. Very, very funny. But the point is made in that documentary, Jack, that of the sort of 2,000 aristocrats in the UK, they own a third of the land in the UK. And a lot of it's farmland and a lot of it's shopping centres, and so it's not quite an equitable sort of arrangement. But look, that takes us out this week. I do recommend Frankie Boyle's Farewell to the Monarchy 2023. There's a lot of swearing, as you'd expect from Frankie Boyle.
While we're on that, the Duke of Westminster owns Belgravia.
I'm just trying to think. Is it Regent Street, the big, and around Piccadilly? They're basically all owned by the royal family, and so they significant land holdings that have basically been around since William the Conqueror. Please do check out the Boyle Take, rather rough and tumble Scottish comedian. Very, very funny. Check it out on YouTube. And thank you, Jack, for your time today. We've run a little bit long. We had a couple of tech problems along the way. But thank you for your time today, Jack.
Cheers, mate.
And we just want to remind our listeners, please drop us a line, including you, Ray. You will not be ignored, I promise. We'll get to it. Drop us a line whenever you like. You know how to get hold of me on Twitter, and you can get hold of Jack on his Substack, which I think is HKJack at
HongKongJack.substack.com.
There you go. Check that out too. Drop him a line too and let him know what you think of him. And listeners, we'll be back next week. We will have that conversation on the developing world and energy usage, because the figures are pretty staggering, I can tell you. That'll be kicking us off. Well, won't be leading us off, but we will have that as an advanced discussion. We hope you've enjoyed what we've discussed today, and we look forward to catching up with you again next week. See you, listeners. Bye.